The courtroom buzzed with tension as the prosecutor's voice droned on about financial fraud, the weight of the case hanging heavy in the air. Judge Matthew Carlton sat on the bench, his composed demeanor unwavering, until the heavy wooden doors crashed open. All eyes turned toward the disturbance as a boy, no older than 15, strode into the room, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You've lied long enough," the boy shouted, pointing directly at the judge. "I'm your son." Gasps erupted across the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, and Matthew's world seemed to tilt on its axis. The boy's fierce eyes, brimming with anger and determination, locked onto his. For the first time in years, Matthew felt his carefully controlled life slipping from his grasp as the echoes of a past he thought he'd buried came rushing back. Who was this boy? Was his claim true, or was there something even deeper, even darker, lurking beneath his words? Before we dive into this riveting story of secrets, redemption, and unexpected family ties, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're ready for a tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe. The grand courtroom, bathed in the golden hues of the late afternoon sun, stood as a symbol of justice and authority. Judge Matthew Carlton, a man in his late 50s with a commanding presence, presided over the bench. His black judicial robes hung elegantly, lending him an aura of composure and respect that few dared to question. This particular afternoon, Matthew was midway through the closing arguments of a high-profile financial fraud case, his sharp blue eyes fixed intently on the prosecutor addressing the room. The evidence presented undeniably shows that the defendants willfully deceived their investors, the prosecutor argued, his voice resonating through the courtroom. But Matthew, ever the seasoned professional, maintained a calm demeanor, jotting occasional notes in his leather-bound journal with a practiced hand. Just as he glanced at his watch, noting it was nearing 4:30 p.m., the tranquility of the courtroom shattered. The heavy wooden doors swung open with a thunderous crash, silencing the room. Gasps rippled through the audience, and the gallery's attention abruptly diverted from the trial. A boy, tall, slender, and no older than 15, strode purposefully down the aisle. His dark eyes burned with defiance, and his scuffed sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. Clad in a rumpled school uniform, he looked out of place amidst the solemn atmosphere. Yet, his presence commanded attention. "You've lied long enough," the boy declared, his voice sharp and unwavering. "I'm your son." The courtroom froze in collective disbelief. Reporters scrambled to jot down the unexpected turn of events, their pens flying across notepads. Matthew's gaze locked onto the boy, his typically stoic expression betraying a flicker of shock. The declaration struck him like a bolt of lightning, dragging his mind to memories long buried, fragments of a past he had tried hard to forget. The young man stood firm, unyielding under the weight of 100 questioning eyes. His voice carried both pain and determination. "You can't deny it anymore, Judge Carlton. My mother told me the truth before she died. You're my father." Matthew, rooted in his seat, felt his heart race. The name of the boy's mother, Laura Carter, hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard that name in nearly 2 decades. Images flashed in his mind, a warm smile, quiet conversations at a charity event, and a connection he hadn't thought significant at the time. The sudden appearance of this boy, who now claimed to be his son, shook the very foundation of his carefully constructed life. The bailiff approached the boy, resting a firm hand on his shoulder. "Young man, this is highly inappropriate," he said, attempting to guide him out. But the boy didn't budge. "I have proof," Elijah declared, pulling a crumpled envelope from his backpack and tossing it onto the prosecutor's desk. "Read it. There's a letter from my mom and a photo. You can't keep running from this." The prosecutor hesitated, his hand hovering over the envelope, as whispers erupted throughout the courtroom. Matthew, still seated at the bench, felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for his reaction. "Your Honor," the bailiff prompted, his grip still firm on Elijah's arm. "Should I escort him out?" Matthew's throat tightened, his voice barely audible. "Yes. Please remove him." Elijah shrugged off the bailiff's hold, just as he was being led away. "She believed in you," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "She said you were a good man, The heavy doors shut behind him with a resounding thud, leaving behind a courtroom plunged into uneasy silence. Matthew stared at the cream-colored envelope resting on the prosecutor's table. The room around him seemed to blur, the weight of the boy's words pressing down on him like a crushing tide. The crowd's murmurs gradually subsided as the trial resumed, but for Matthew, everything else had faded into insignificance. His past had come back to haunt him in a way he could never have anticipated. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind Elijah Carter, the tension in the room remained palpable. Judge Matthew Carlton sat motionless on the bench, his gaze fixed on the envelope resting precariously at the edge of the prosecutor's table. The trial's rhythm had been disrupted, but the memory of the boy's words played on repeat in Matthew's mind. "You're my father." The phrase echoed with such intensity that it drowned out the prosecutor's attempts to resume his arguments. Matthew's usually steady hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. He had built a life defined by order, precision, and unwavering justice. Now, with one sentence, that foundation felt dangerously unstable. "Your Honor?" The prosecutor's voice broke through the haze, his tone unsure. Matthew blinked, momentarily disoriented. "Proceed," he said curtly, waving a hand to signal for the trial to continue. But his voice lacked its usual authority, and the courtroom buzzed with subdued whispers. The audience, reporters, and even the court clerks exchanged furtive glances. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was it true? Hours later, when the court session finally adjourned, Matthew found himself standing in his chambers, staring blankly at the envelope now placed on his desk. He hesitated before reaching for it, as if the mere act of opening it would irreversibly alter his life. With deliberate care, he unfolded the letter inside, its edges worn and creased. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, undeniably feminine. Laura Carter's voice seemed to leap off the page as Matthew read her words. "Matthew, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to explain the truth myself. I've wrestled with this decision for years, but Elijah deserves to know who you are. He's your son, Matthew. The same night we met at the charity event, our lives changed forever, even if you didn't realize it. I never wanted to disrupt your life, but I had no choice. Please, if nothing else, help him now that I'm gone. He's all I ever had. Laura." The letter slipped from Matthew's fingers, landing softly on his desk. The photograph that had been tucked inside slid halfway out, revealing Laura's smiling face. She looked younger, happier, like the woman he vaguely remembered from that evening years ago. Next to her, a small boy with curious eyes clung to her side, his face unmistakably Elijah's. Matthew sank into his chair, running a hand through his silver hair. The memory of the charity event began to resurface in fragments. Laura, dressed in a black catering uniform, gracefully navigated the crowd of affluent donors. Her voice had been soft but firm, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. They'd spoken briefly near the coat check, discussing the hospital fundraiser and the importance of second chances. Nothing more, or so he thought. Now, the possibility that those moments had led to something far greater and far more complicated gnawed at him. Could it be true? The intercom on his desk buzzed, startling him. "Judge Carlton," came the voice of his assistant, Carol. "The afternoon docket starts in 15 minutes. "I'll be there shortly," Matthew replied, his voice gruff. He quickly folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope, sealing it as though trying to contain the whirlwind it had unleashed. As the day drew to a close, Matthew's mind remained preoccupied with questions. Was Laura's claim legitimate? If Elijah truly was his son, why had she waited so long to tell him? And why now, when she was no longer alive, to provide answers? That night, Matthew sat in his dimly lit study, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk beside him. He stared at the photograph for hours, searching Laura's face for clues, for some hidden meaning behind her smile. Across town, Elijah sat on a narrow cot in the youth shelter, clutching a photo of his mother. The edges were worn from years of handling, her image a source of comfort amidst the chaos of his life. His thoughts swirled with grief and frustration. Why didn't he say anything? Elijah muttered to himself, his fists clenched. He had walked into that courtroom expecting answers, only to leave feeling more abandoned than ever. His mother's final words had been clear. Matthew Carlton was his father, the man who could finally give him the stability he'd always craved. Yet the man who sat behind the bench seemed reluctant to acknowledge him. Elijah's resolve hardened. He would make Matthew face the truth, no matter what it took. The city was cloaked in twilight as Judge Matthew Carlton drove home, his thoughts a tangled web of doubt and denial. The letter and photograph remained sealed in his briefcase, but they weighed heavily on him as if threatening to spill secrets with every bump in the road. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself, not as a judge, but as a man. When Matthew arrived at his stately suburban home, the sense of order he had always relied upon felt like a distant memory. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking the passage of time, but to him it only amplified the chaos of the day. Sitting at the kitchen table, he reached for his phone. His sister Catherine was the only person who might understand the storm raging within him. She had been his confidant growing up, someone who had witnessed the fractures in their family long before they'd become permanent. Yet his thumb hovered over her contact name. How could he even begin to explain this to her? Instead, he poured himself a fresh glass of bourbon and retreated to his study. The photograph of Laura stared back at him from his desk. The boy beside her, Elijah, had the same piercing eyes. Was that enough to prove the boy's claim? No, Matthew needed more than that. The following day, Matthew made arrangements for a DNA test. It was a clinical step devoid of the emotion that threatened to consume him. Let the science decide, he told himself. But even as he provided his sample, the act felt cold and insufficient. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, whatever it turned out to be, would demand far more from him than he was prepared to give. Meanwhile, at the youth shelter, Elijah's anger festered. The sterile, overcrowded environment offered little solace, and the whispered conversations of other teens only heightened his sense of isolation. He replayed the courtroom scene in his mind, dissecting every moment. Had he spoken too harshly? Had his approach been wrong? "Hey, Elijah," one of the counselors called out, pulling him from his thoughts. "You've got mail." Elijah frowned as he took the envelope, its return address unfamiliar. He tore it open to find a letter from a lawyer representing Judge Matthew Carlton. The words were carefully chosen, neutral yet distant. "Dear Mr. Carter, Judge Carlton has taken your claims seriously and has initiated steps to verify your allegations. Please understand that this is a sensitive matter and will require time. Until then, we ask for your patience." Elijah crumpled the letter in frustration. "Patience?" he muttered bitterly. His entire life had been a waiting game, waiting for his mother to come home from her long shifts, waiting for answers about his father, waiting for a stability that always felt out of reach. The counselor, sensing Elijah's agitation, approached cautiously. "You okay, kid?" Elijah forced a tight smile. "Yeah, fine." But he wasn't fine. That night, as he lay awake on the narrow cot, he made a silent vow. If Matthew Carlton wasn't going to confront the truth willingly, Elijah would force his hand. Back at the courthouse, Matthew's carefully constructed facade began to crack. His colleagues, sharp-eyed and curious, couldn't ignore the whispers surrounding the dramatic interruption in his courtroom. The legal community, as insulated as it was, thrived on gossip. Questions lingered in the air. Was there truth to the boy's claim? Would the judge's pristine reputation survive the scandal? "Matthew," a voice interrupted his thoughts as he stood by the coffee station in the judge's lounge. It was Judge Rebecca Holmes, a longtime colleague. "Rebecca," he greeted her with forced politeness, but her piercing gaze made it clear she wasn't here for small talk. "I heard about the incident in your courtroom," she said, her tone both cautious and probing. "Are you handling it?" "It's a personal matter," Matthew replied curtly, hoping to end the conversation. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Personal matters have a way of becoming very public, Matthew. Take care of it before it takes care of you." The weight of her warning hung over him long after she left. For the first time, Matthew began to see how deeply Elijah's claims could unravel his life, not just his career, but the fragile relationships he had with those around him. That evening, Matthew sat alone in his study once more, the DNA test results still days away. The silence was deafening. His reflection in the window felt like that of a stranger, a man forced to confront the parts of his past he had long buried. In a small apartment across town, Elijah rummaged through his late mother's belongings, now packed into cardboard boxes. Among the trinkets and photographs, he found an old journal. The faded ink told the story of a young woman's struggles, her hopes, and her heartbreak. "I met someone tonight," one entry read. "He was kind, different. I didn't expect much, but maybe this is the start of something." Elijah's fingers brushed the page as if trying to feel his mother's presence. Her words were both a comfort and a reminder of what he had lost, but they also fueled his determination. The truth was out there, and Elijah intended to find it, no matter how painful it might be. The following days brought no clarity, only more questions. For Matthew Carlton, the DNA test was a ticking clock, each passing hour weighing heavier than the last. His routine became mechanical. He heard cases, wrote rulings, and returned home to face the silence of his study. The letter from Laura and the photograph were still on his desk, haunting reminders of a truth he wasn't ready to confront. At the youth shelter, Elijah spent his days researching everything he could about Matthew. He sat at the library's dimly lit computer station, poring over articles and legal briefs that painted a picture of a man who seemed untouchable. The esteemed Judge Carlton was widely respected and a symbol of justice in the city. But to Elijah, he was a man hiding behind his robe, refusing to acknowledge the son he had abandoned. On one particular evening, Elijah unearthed a collection of newspaper clippings his mother had saved. The articles spanned years, chronicling Matthew's rise to prominence. One photo showed Matthew smiling alongside a group of dignitaries at a charity event. Laura was in the background, barely visible, carrying a tray of glasses. Elijah stared at her face, recognizing the quiet pride she always carried, even when life weighed her down. She believed in him, Elijah muttered to himself, his fingers tracing her outline. Why? Back at the courthouse, Matthew was grappling with his own ghosts. While sorting through his files one evening, he stumbled upon an old photograph buried beneath years of documents. It was from his younger days, at the very same charity event, that had now become central to this mystery. In the photo, Laura's smile stood out against the crowd's polished indifference. Matthew remembered that night more vividly than he cared to admit. The hospital fundraiser had been his first major event after being appointed to the bench. He had been full of ambition, eager to prove himself. Laura had been a server, her quiet dignity catching his attention. They had spoken briefly about her work, her dreams, and the challenges she faced. He had admired her resilience, though their connection had felt fleeting at the time. Could it have been more? Matthew struggled to recall the details, but the gaps in his memory frustrated him. His mind returned to his brother, Jacob Carlton, whose turbulent life had cast a long shadow over the family. Jacob had always been reckless, chasing quick fixes, and leaving destruction in his wake. Memories of Jacob's volatile temper and strained relationships resurfaced, each one layered with unanswered questions. The tension in Matthew's life began to spill over into his work. During a particularly contentious trial, his mind wandered, his usual sharpness dulled by the weight of Elijah's claim. When the defense attorney raised an objection, Matthew was beaten too long to respond. The gallery noticed. So did his colleagues. After the court adjourned, Matthew found himself face to face with Rebecca Holmes again. Her concern was less veiled this time. "Matthew," she said firmly, pulling him aside in the hallway, "you're distracted. This isn't like you." "I'm fine," he replied tersely, but Rebecca's penetrating gaze didn't waver. "This thing with the boy, if it's true, you need to deal with it now. If it's not, you still need to deal with it. Ignoring it won't make it go away." Matthew nodded stiffly, though her words stung. He knew she was right. The question was how to handle a situation that was so far beyond his control. Meanwhile, Elijah was discovering truths of his own. Late one night, as he sorted through his mother's belongings, he found a small box tucked away in the corner of a suitcase. Inside were mementos he hadn't seen before, a hospital bracelet with his birth date, letters addressed to no one, and an old wedding invitation. His heart skipped a beat as he read the names, Jacob Carlton and Laura Carter. Jacob Carlton? Elijah whispered aloud. The name was unfamiliar, but the surname wasn't. He stared at the document, confusion swirling in his mind. Could this Jacob be connected to Matthew? If so, how? The discovery set off a whirlwind of thoughts. The name on the invitation didn't align with what his mother had told him about his father. Was Jacob the man she had run from all those years? And if so, why had she named Matthew as Elijah's father instead? Elijah's mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. He needed answers, and the only person who could provide them was Matthew. The next morning, Elijah showed up unannounced at the courthouse, waiting by the entrance with the wedding invitation clutched tightly in his hand. When Matthew stepped out of his car, their eyes met across the plaza. "We need to talk," Elijah said, his voice steady but firm. Matthew hesitated but nodded, gesturing for Elijah to follow him inside. Together, they stepped into his private chambers, where years of buried truths were about to come to light. Matthew Carlton closed the door to his chambers, the silence between him and Elijah palpable. The boy's dark eyes burned with a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, determination. Matthew gestured toward the chair across from his desk, but Elijah remained standing, his posture rigid. "What is it you want to say, Elijah?" Matthew asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "This," Elijah said, thrusting the wedding invitation onto the desk. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "Explain this." Matthew's heart sank as his eyes fell on the document. The names stared back at him, Jacob Carlton and Laura Carter. He picked up the invitation, the weight of it almost too much to bear. For a moment, he was transported back to the days leading up to Jacob's short-lived marriage. The memories were chaotic, tainted by Jacob's volatility and the tension that had permeated every family gathering. "Where did you find this?" Matthew asked quietly. "In my mom's things," Elijah replied. His voice rose, frustration bubbling to the surface. "She never told me about Jacob. She said you were my father. So why would she lie about that?" Matthew set the invitation down carefully, folding his hands together. He had no immediate answers, only a growing sense of unease. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman, Elijah," he began, his voice measured. "But she was also someone who carried a lot of pain. Pain caused by my brother." Elijah's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" Matthew leaned back in his chair, the weight of years of silence pressing down on him. "Jacob was troubled. He and your mother were married, yes, but their relationship was far from happy. Jacob's temper and his reckless behavior caused more harm than I care to admit, and I failed her by not stepping in when I should have." Elijah processed this in silence, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "So, he's my real father?" Matthew hesitated. "The DNA test will confirm everything soon. But from what I know now, yes, it's likely that Jacob is your biological father." The words hung heavy in the room, each syllable a blow to Elijah's fragile sense of identity. His voice cracked as he asked, "Then why would she tell me you were my dad? Why wouldn't she just tell me the truth?" Matthew's throat tightened. "Maybe because she wanted you to have a better image of a father. Someone she believed could offer you stability, protection, things Jacob never could." Elijah turned away, his shoulders shaking. "She lied to me. All my life, she lied." "She was trying to protect you," Matthew said softly, rising from his chair. He walked around the desk, standing at a respectful distance. "Elijah, your mother loved you more than anything. Sometimes, love makes us do things that might not seem fair or honest, but her intentions were good. She wanted you to feel safe." Elijah spun around, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Safe? Do you have any idea what it's like to move every 6 months? To sleep in shelters because your mom's too scared to stay in one place? To watch her work herself into the ground just to keep us alive? That's not safety." Matthew's heart ached at the raw pain in Elijah's voice. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the chasm between them, but he knew the boy needed space to vent. "I can't change what happened," Matthew said quietly, "but I can promise you this. I'll help you find the truth about Jacob. I'll make sure you never have to face this alone again." Elijah studied him, his jaw tightening. "What if I don't want your help?" "Then I'll still be here," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "No matter what you decide, I'm not walking away." The boy's defiance wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He sank into the chair he'd refused earlier, burying his face in his hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Elijah looked up, his voice quieter. "Do you think he's still alive?" Matthew nodded slowly. "I've been looking into it. There are signs that Jacob faked his death years ago. If that's true, he could still be out there. Elijah's fists clenched again, but this time with a different kind of resolve. Then we find him. And he answers for what he did. Matthew met his gaze, a sense of determination settling in his chest. We will, together. For the first time, a fragile understanding passed between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Matthew Carlton had always prided himself on his ability to unravel the most complex legal cases, but tracking down his estranged brother Jacob was an entirely different challenge. The fragments of evidence he'd gathered painted a troubling picture. Financial withdrawals, fake identities, and a trail of deceit stretching across decades. With Elijah's determination fueling his own, Matthew knew there was no turning back. In the days that followed their confrontation, Matthew devoted his evenings to combing through old records and legal databases. His position as a judge gave him access to resources that most people couldn't reach. But even with that advantage, Jacob had been meticulous in covering his tracks. Elijah sat across from him at the dining table. The wedding invitation and Laura's journal spread out between them. The boy's fiery resolve had been tempered by a cautious curiosity. "You're sure he's alive?" Elijah asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "I'm certain," Matthew replied, tapping a printout of a property record. "This house in Arizona was purchased 6 years ago under the name James Anders. The signature matches Jacob's handwriting. He's alive, Elijah, and he's been living under a new identity." Elijah's fists clenched. "He just ran away? Left us behind like we didn't matter?" Matthew leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jacob has always been a man who avoided responsibility. But this time, we're going to make him face it." A break in the search came when Matthew uncovered a grainy photograph from a traffic violation database. It showed an older man with a weathered face and graying hair, but the eyes were unmistakable. Jacob's sharp, calculating gaze stared back from the screen. Elijah leaned over Matthew's shoulder, his breath hitching. "That's him," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Arizona," Matthew confirmed. "We'll need to go there and confront him directly." The boy's initial anger simmered into nervous energy. What if he denies everything? What if he doesn't care? Matthew placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Then we'll make him care. This isn't just about finding Jacob, it's about giving you the closure you deserve." The next morning, the two of them boarded a flight to Arizona, the weight of the impending confrontation hanging heavy in the air. Matthew had prepared as best he could, compiling a folder of evidence, Jacob's fake death certificate, his property purchases, and a timeline of his activities. But no amount of preparation could quell the unease he felt about facing his brother again. For Elijah, the journey was both terrifying and exhilarating. The boy who had stormed into Matthew's courtroom weeks ago now felt an unfamiliar sense of trust in the man beside him. As the plane descended toward the red rock desert landscape of Sedona, Elijah glanced at Matthew and saw not just a judge, but an ally. Their destination was a modest house on the outskirts of town. The property was unremarkable, its faded paint and overgrown yard blending into the quiet neighborhood. Elijah hesitated as they approached the door, his heart pounding. "Are you ready for this?" Matthew asked, his voice steady. Elijah nodded, though his palms were slick with sweat. "Yeah, let's do it." Matthew knocked firmly on the door. For a long moment, there was no response. Just as they were about to knock again, the door creaked open, revealing a man who seemed both familiar and foreign. Jacob Carlton, or James Anders as he now called himself, looked older, his once sharp features softened by years of hiding. His eyes darted between Matthew and Elijah, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he masked it with a strained smile. Well, Jacob drawled, leaning against the doorframe. "Look who decided to visit, the Honorable Judge Carlton and a guest." His gaze lingered on Elijah, his expression unreadable. "We're not here for pleasantries," Matthew said firmly. "We need to talk, Jacob." Jacob's smirk faltered, but he stepped aside, allowing them in. The inside of the house was cluttered, the air heavy with the scent of stale coffee and neglect. Matthew and Elijah took seats on a worn couch, while Jacob remained standing, his posture tense. "What do you want?" Jacob asked, crossing his arms. "The truth," Matthew said, pulling the folder of evidence from his briefcase. "We know you faked your death. We know you left Laura and Elijah behind. And we know you've been hiding here for years while they suffered." Jacob's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he let out a bitter laugh. You don't understand anything, do you? You've always been so quick to judge, so quick to assume you're better than me. This isn't about me, Matthew replied evenly. This is about Elijah. He deserves answers. Jacob's eyes flicked to the boy, who stared back with a mixture of anger and longing. For the first time, Jacob's defenses seemed to crack. I never meant for things to get this bad, he muttered, his voice quieter. But you let them, Elijah shot back, his voice trembling. You left us, you left my mom to pick up the pieces while you… What? Started over? Jacob looked away, guilt etched into his features. It wasn't that simple. It never is, Matthew said, his tone sharp. But it's time to stop running, Jacob. You owe Elijah and Laura the truth. Jacob Carlton paced the small, cluttered living room, his steps heavy with the weight of years spent evading responsibility. His brother and nephew sat across from him, their expressions a stark contrast. Matthew was calm but resolute, and Elijah was a storm of emotions barely contained. I didn't have a choice, Jacob muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. I was drowning in debt, hounded by creditors. Laura, she was better off without me. Elijah shot to his feet, his voice rising. Better off? Do you think abandoning her, abandoning me, made things better? We were homeless. She worked herself sick trying to keep us afloat while you were out here playing dead. Jacob flinched at Elijah's words, his guilt palpable. You don't understand what it was like, he said defensively. I had nothing left to give. And that made it okay? Matthew interjected, his voice cool but firm. You didn't just abandon Laura. You robbed her of any chance to move on, to seek help, to build a stable life for Elijah. Jacob turned to his brother, anger flashing in his eyes. Don't act like you're innocent in all this, Matthew. You think I didn't notice how you looked at her? Always swooping in to save the day, the golden boy doing the right thing while I was the screw-up. This isn't about me, Matthew replied, his tone measured. This is about you facing the consequences of your choices. Elijah deserves that much. The room fell silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jacob sank into a threadbare armchair, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked directly at Elijah, and his voice softened. I didn't want this for you, kid, he said. I thought if I stayed away, you'd have a better life. I thought Laura, she'd find someone else, someone who could take care of you both. Elijah's hands clenched into fists. She didn't need someone else. She needed you. Jacob's guilt-filled gaze dropped to the floor. I know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The sound of distant sirens broke the heavy silence, growing louder with each passing second. Matthew stood, his expression unreadable as he walked to the window. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the dusty glass, confirming what he already knew. They're here, Matthew said quietly, his voice steady. Jacob's head snapped up, panic flickering in his eyes. You called the cops on me? You committed crimes, Jacob, Matthew replied, his tone unwavering. Fraud, faking your death, abandoning your family. It's time to answer for them. Jacob rose to his feet, his anger boiling over. You self-righteous hypocrite. Always so quick to judge, to decide what's right and wrong for everyone else. But what about you? You're no saint, Matthew. Elijah stepped forward, placing himself between the two men. His voice cut through their argument like a knife. Stop it, both of you. He turned to Jacob, his voice trembling but resolute. You're right. Uncle Matthew's not perfect. None of us are. But at least he's here. At least he's trying. Jacob's defiance faltered, and he slumped back into the chair. The sirens outside grew louder, the flashing lights casting shifting shadows across the room. The knock on the door was firm and authoritative. Matthew opened it to reveal two officers, their expressions professional but sympathetic. Jacob Carlton? One of them asked. Jacob nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. Yeah, that's me. You're under arrest for charges including fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice, the officer said. Please stand and place your hands behind your back. Jacob obeyed without resistance, his movements slow and deliberate. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he glanced at Elijah one last time. For what it's worth, Jacob said, his voice heavy with regret, I'm sorry. Elijah didn't respond, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The officers led Jacob out of the house, their figures disappearing into the night. As the police car pulled away, Elijah remained rooted in place, staring after it. Matthew placed a steadying hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Elijah nodded, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't know," he admitted. "It's a lot." "It is," Matthew agreed. "But you don't have to face it alone." They left the house in silence. The night air was cool and still. As they walked to their car, Elijah glanced up at Matthew, a small but genuine smile breaking through the turmoil on his face. "Thanks for not giving up on me," Elijah said softly. "Never," Matthew replied, his voice steady. "We're family, Elijah, and family doesn't give up." The drive back to the hotel was quiet, the weight of the night settling over Matthew and Elijah like a heavy blanket. Neither spoke, lost in their own thoughts. For Elijah, the confrontation with Jacob had dredged up feelings he hadn't fully processed: anger, hurt, and a faint glimmer of closure. For Matthew, it had forced him to face the fractures in his family and the choices that had left lasting scars. When they reached the hotel, Elijah flopped onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. He said he was sorry, he muttered, more to himself than to Matthew. Matthew sat in the chair by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. "Do you believe him?" he asked gently. Elijah was silent for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe, but it doesn't really change anything, does it?" "No," Matthew said softly, "but it's a start. Acknowledging what he did wrong is the first step. The rest, that's up to him now." Elijah nodded, his face thoughtful. "Do you think people can really change?" Matthew considered the question carefully. "I think they can," he said, "but it takes time, effort, and a willingness to face the truth, even when it's painful. Jacob has a lot of work to do, and whether he succeeds or not, that's not your burden to carry." Elijah turned his head to look at Matthew. "But it's still part of who I am, isn't it? No matter how much I want to forget, he's my dad." Matthew's expression softened. "Biologically, yes. But Elijah, biology doesn't define who you are. The choices you make, the person you become, those are what matter. And I see someone strong, resilient, and kind. That's who you are." The boy's lips quirked into a faint smile. "You really believe that?" "I do," Matthew said firmly, "and I'll remind you as many times as you need to hear it." The next day they returned home, their shared silence on the flight a reflection of the deep bond that had grown between them. For Matthew, this trip had solidified something he had only begun to realize. Elijah wasn't just his nephew. He was family in the truest sense of the word, someone he was willing to fight for and protect. For Elijah, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Though the pain of his past lingered, he found solace in knowing he wasn't alone anymore. Over the following weeks, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Matthew converted his study into a bedroom for Elijah, letting the boy choose the paint color and decorations. By the time they were finished, the walls were a deep, calming blue, adorned with posters of Elijah's favorite basketball players. It was the first time in years that Elijah had room to call his own, and the smile on his face as he hung his final poster warmed Matthew's heart. "You did good, Uncle Matthew," Elijah said, stepping back to admire their work. "Not bad for an old man, huh?" Matthew teased, ruffling Elijah's hair. Their days were filled with new routines, shared meals, long talks, and Saturday morning basketball games in the driveway. Margaret, Matthew's wife, had been cautious at first, unsure of how this new dynamic would fit into their lives. But as she watched Elijah open up and find his place, her reservations melted away. One evening, Margaret brought out a photo album she'd been working on. "I thought we could add to this," she said, setting it on the dining table. Elijah flipped through the pages, his eyes widening at the collection of pictures. There were snapshots of him and Matthew painting his new room, candid shots of them playing basketball, and even a picture from their trip to Arizona. "You kept all these?" Elijah asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Every moment matters," Margaret said with a gentle smile. Elijah's expression softened. "Thanks for letting me be part of this." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are part of this, always." The following weekend, they visited Laura's grave together. Elijah knelt before the headstone, placing a bouquet of white lilies at its base. His voice was steady as he spoke. "Mom, I hope you're proud of me," he said softly. "I found him. I found family, just like you wanted." Matthew stood a few steps behind, giving Elijah the space he needed. When Elijah rose, Matthew placed a hand on his shoulder, and the two of them shared a quiet moment of connection. As they walked back to the car, Elijah glanced up at Matthew. "Do you think she'd be okay with all this?" Matthew smiled gently. "I think she'd be more than okay. She'd be proud of you, of the man you're becoming." For the first time in a long while, Elijah felt at peace. He wasn't defined by his past or the mistakes of others. He was building something new, something strong and enduring, with the family he had found. The story of Elijah Carter and Judge Matthew Carlton is one of unexpected connections, painful truths, and ultimately, the transformative power of love and resilience. It began with anger and confusion as a young man, scarred by abandonment, sought answers from a man he believed to be his father. It could have ended in resentment and further disconnection, but instead it unfolded as a journey toward understanding, healing, and the creation of a family bound not by blood alone, but by choice and commitment. At its heart, this story highlights the complexities of human relationships. Matthew, a man who prided himself on order and justice, was forced to confront the flaws in his past and the ways they shaped those around him. Elijah, a boy hardened by loss and struggle, learned to open his heart to new possibilities, discovering that family isn't always about where you come from, but about who stands by you when it matters most. Jacob Carlton's role as the absent father serves as a stark reminder of the impact of our actions or inactions on those we leave behind. His choices left deep scars, but they also illuminated the strength and perseverance of Laura Carter, a mother who did everything in her power to protect her son. Her story is one of quiet heroism, a testament to the sacrifices parents make out of love and the hope that their children will find a brighter future. This journey also underscores the importance of confronting the past, no matter how painful it may be. Both Elijah and Matthew had to face uncomfortable truths to move forward. In doing so, they showed us that healing isn't about erasing what happened, but about finding the courage to build something new from the pieces left behind. For viewers, the lesson is clear. Life is messy, and relationships are complicated, but it's never too late to make amends, touch out, and create meaningful connections. This story reminds us that while we can't always change the past, we have the power to shape the future through honesty, compassion, and unwavering support for one another. In the end, Elijah and Matthew didn't just rebuild their lives, they redefined what family means. Their story is proof that even in the face of brokenness, there is always hope for healing and redemption. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Did it resonate with your own experiences? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And if you have your own stories of resilience, family, or forgiveness, we'd love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to make sure you never miss another meaningful story. Share your thoughts about this journey in the comments below. We're eager to hear your perspective and what this story meant to you. Thank you for joining us, and remember, every story has the power to change a life, including yours. Stay connected, stay inspired, and we'll see you in the next one.